15 years of unwavering loyalty, punctuality, and sleepless nights under fluorescent office lights. That was my life. I wasn't just another name on the employee list. I was the guy who trained the rookies, covered weekend shifts, and solved fires others didn't dare touch. From the moment I stepped into Barton and Leeds, fresh out of college with nothing but a borrowed tie and hope in my eyes, I gave them everything. I stayed late even when I wasn't paid, answered calls during my honeymoon, and missed my father's funeral for a client presentation that won us the Jefferson account. But loyalty is a one-way street in the corporate world. I sensed the chill months before they pulled the trigger. Then came the worst part: management's smiles. Not the usual grateful nods I once got, but tight-lipped corporate grins hiding the blade. They didn't even look me in the eye when they scheduled that performance review. I knew it wasn't about performance. It was execution day. They just needed to wait for HR to type the letter, and I was ready. I had quietly backed up emails, client correspondence, project notes, and, most importantly, the memo trail of unethical shortcuts they pressured me into approving years ago, under duress, under false pretenses, and always with verbal approval only. I knew how this game worked, but they didn't know I had my own pieces on the board. The day they called me in, the air was different. Not nervous, not hospital smug. 3 of them sat there. Martin from HR with his rehearsed empathy, Shelley from legal with her untouched notepad, and Dawn, my ex-mentor, turned puppet CEO. "We've decided to part ways," Dawn said as if it was mutual. I didn't flinch. I had already sent a scheduled email that morning to my personal attorney and copied it to a secure cloud folder. "Understood," I said calmly. "That threw them off?" Martin blinked. Shelley tilted her head. Dawn narrowed his eyes. No tears, no fight. "That's right." I smiled. "Do I need to sign anything right now?" They shuffled papers and slid a release form forward. Shelley finally spoke. "Legal team." I nodded. Yes. Especially considering the confidentiality clauses in light of certain compliance anomalies I was recently reviewing. That word compliance landed like a grenade. Shelley stiffened. Dawn sat up straighter. "We don't have anything to hide," he said too quickly. "Good," I replied. "Neither do I, and I'm sure the board would appreciate a thorough discussion about procurement contracts from 2021. That was enough. Their expressions shifted from smug to alarmed. But I didn't push further. Not yet. Let them sweat. Because revenge, in the corporate world, is best served with a smile and a subpoena. I walked out of that room with my badge clipped to my pocket like a trophy. I didn't plan to leak them online or shout on social media. That's amateur revenge. Mine was surgical. Over the next 2 days, I did nothing publicly. But privately, my lawyer was assembling a package. A whistleblower claim, backed by evidence of tax misreporting, internal policy violations, and one very juicy email chain showing executives approving a cover-up of faulty financial reports to investors. I knew this because I was the one they trusted to clean up those reports. I kept quiet then because I believed I was protecting the company. But now, I saw what they were. Cowards who used people like tissue paper. My lawyer advised patience. We drafted the complaint meticulously. We didn't aim for viral outrage. We aimed for SEC eyes and federal ears. Meanwhile, I got messages from coworkers, some confused, others sympathetic, and a few warning me to stay quiet for my own good. That only fueled me more. They thought I was alone, but they underestimated the one thing they could never measure in quarterly reviews: my memory. Every slight, every lie, every knife in the back, I had the receipts, and I was ready to make them count. By the end of that week, I was already getting pings from anonymous LinkedIn recruiters. News of my departure had mysteriously spread. I didn't reply to any of them yet. I had bigger things brewing. My attorney filed the whistleblower paperwork by Friday morning, and it was airtight. I wasn't doing this for money, though. A reward was likely. I was doing this for dignity. I still had a move they wouldn't see coming. I reached out to 3 former clients, major ones I had brought in myself, and shared my departure. Professionally, I didn't say anything negative, just facts. One of them asked, "Why would they let someone like you go?" I just replied, "That's a question worth asking." The next week, Barton and Leeds lost 2 of those clients. Another sent a notice of intent to audit that shook them. I heard from a former colleague that Dawn was scrambling, blaming others, and HR was reviewing exit protocols like it mattered. I smiled quietly. This wasn't petty revenge. It was justice cold, methodical, and fully documented. And it had just begun. The storm hit their offices harder than I'd anticipated. A week after I filed the whistleblower complaint, I received a message from an investigator requesting a follow-up interview. My lawyer arranged it. Calmly, clearly, and with every supporting document in place. I walked them through the entire Timeline from the doctored reports to the manipulated vendor contracts. I just laid out the facts. Numbers don't lie. But the best part was watching them scramble from a distance. Internal audits were triggered. The compliance team was blindsided because they didn't know half the things that had gone on above their heads. Meanwhile, Don had the nerve to call me through a mutual acquaintance. "Let's talk like professionals," he said. I declined. My lawyer responded with a formal letter reminding them that all communications should go through legal counsel. But I knew Don. His ego wouldn't let it go. He thought he was invincible, that the company's legacy would shield him. But Barton? And I had pulled one of the foundation blocks. Still, I wasn't celebrating yet. I was waiting for the board to react, and they did. A week later, I got wind that an emergency meeting had been called. A familiar face from finance who once shadowed me during her internship messaged me, "You might want to keep your phone." On next week, I didn't ask why. I already knew. The following Monday, I was sipping coffee when the headlines broke. Barton and Leeds faces federal scrutiny over financial reporting. It wasn't just a blog or a small-time post. It was, in the financial section of a national business publication, the article quoted anonymous sources from inside the firm and hinted at potential fraud. I wasn't named directly, but the details were unmistakable. My lawyer congratulated me on a clean submission. "They can't retaliate against you now," she said, "but if they try, we have them by the throat." The article triggered something. I hadn't anticipated former employees began sharing their stories online. One after another, people described being silenced, manipulated, or pushed out. Some even messaged me privately to thank me. That part wasn't part of the plan, but it was the most gratifying. See, revenge isn't always about watching someone fall. Sometimes it's about lighting a beacon so others can speak too. But back at Barton and Leeds, it wasn't just reputations being torched, was stockholder confidence. Their value dipped. Within 48 hours, I smiled not because I hated the company, but because I loved what I had built there, and they destroyed it for short-term greed. They thought firing me would save them money. Instead, it cost them everything. I didn't stop. There, with my name freshly cleared and my reputation untarnished, I reached out to one of our biggest rival firms not as a job seeker, but as a consultant. I pitched myself as someone who understood not just project management, but corporate recovery, risk mitigation, and internal culture reform. Irony. They were offering more than Barton and Leeds ever did in 15 years. But the real irony came when one of the junior execs from Barton and Leeds, someone who once took credit for my proposal in a board meeting, tried to contact me under a fake profile for a referral. That was my quiet answer. Meanwhile, Shelley from legal, who had smiled during my termination, was placed on leave pending an ethics investigation. HR issued a vague public memo about transparency and internal reviews, but no one was buying it. Clients were pulling out, partners were whispering about dissolution, and Dawn finally went silent. But I wasn't finished yet. The most satisfying blow was still in the works. Of final card I had held back for maximum effect. Years ago, I had been asked quietly and off-record to approve a shady contractor payment that involved inflated invoices. It was for a marketing campaign that never really existed. I had refused to sign, but someone else processed it anyway. Using my name on internal documentation, I didn't say anything back then because the pressure was immense and the risks were personal. But now, with legal fire on my side, I retrieved the archived communications and digital timestamps. I handed them to my attorney, who forwarded them to the investigators with a simple note. Forgery suspected, evidence attached, that cracked the case wide open. Barton and Leeds now had potential forgery charges looming on top of SEC violations. I watched it unfold from the comfort of my home office, where my new consulting business was already onboarding to Fortune 500 clients. The press finally caught wind of the forged documentation and ran another article. More than misreporting. Former employee may hold key to criminal inquiry. My inbox exploded. Journalists, former colleagues, even ex-bosses from years ago, offering apologies they never gave when I was under them, but I ignored them all. This wasn't about making friends. It was about restoring balance. Still, I wasn't entirely immune to the emotions that came with all this. There were nights I sat quietly, wondering if it was worth it. I had spent months preparing for this move, sacrificed sleep, studied law. I never thought I'd need reviewed documents line by line until my eyes blurred. I had put everything on the line. What if it had backfired? What if I had missed something? But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the look in Dawn's eyes when I said, "That's a question worth asking." That's when I knew I had done the right thing. And if I didn't stand up now, no one ever would. By now, Barton and Leeds was a sinking ship. News broke that the board had removed Dawn pending investigation. The CFO resigned for personal reasons, and investors were demanding a full audit of the past 5 years. That's when it truly hit me. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about change, about setting a precedent. Companies don't get to exploit people like batteries and toss them out. Not anymore. Not if we stand up. Not if we document. Not if we dare to fight back. The final blow came not from me, but from within. A class action lawsuit was filed by former employees alleging wrongful termination, hostile work environment, and systemic abuse of whistleblower rights. I wasn't part of the lawsuit. I didn't need to be. My actions had lit the match. Now the fire was spreading. I was interviewed for a documentary on corporate retaliation, though I kept my face off screen. I wasn't seeking fame. I wanted accountability. The story struck a chord online. A hashtag trended for days. Politicians started referencing it in debates about labor reform. Barton and Leeds became a cautionary tale in business schools. Professors used my case as a lesson in ethical collapse. I was invited to speak at a private business ethics conference. I accepted, and when I stood in front of a room full of rising executives and said, "If your company fears transparency, it's already guilty," the applause told me I had made the right choice. I wasn't the guy who got fired anymore. I was the guy who stood up, documented, stayed calm, and flipped the script. The aftermath of Barton and Leeds' downfall sent ripples far beyond their corporate walls. Other firms began quietly reviewing their own internal policies, realizing they might be one whistleblower away from their own reckoning. I received anonymous messages from employees across the country, people who'd been silenced, threatened, and mistreated, all thanking me for showing that it could be done, that someone could go up against a Goliath and survive, even win. I was careful not to romanticize the process. It wasn't easy. It required nerves of steel, flawless documentation, and a clear legal path. But it was possible. The key was preparation. I had spent over a year anticipating the day they'd try to discard me, and I built a shield they couldn't see coming. Revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't a tantrum. It was precision. It was watching the very men who once mocked my caution beg for leniency under the very rules they tried to dodge. I received a letter from one of the board members, a woman I had only briefly spoken to during my time there. She wrote, "If only we had listened to you then, perhaps we wouldn't be unraveling now." It was short and unsigned officially, but it meant something, because even in destruction there are moments of truth. And this was a reckoning, years in the making. I didn't burn bridges. I simply let the ones already rotting collapse under their own weight. Now, years later, I sit across from executive teams, not as an employee but as the consultant they call when they're terrified they're next. I advise them on ethics, culture, and accountability, not as theories, but as someone who's lived through the consequences of their absence. My consulting firm has grown, not because I wanted to run a business, but because the demand became undeniable. People want guidance from someone who's walked the fire and came out refined, not burned. I never framed myself as a victim. I was a witness, a survivor, a professional who didn't let bitterness take over, but channeled it into action. Barton and Leeds no longer exists. The company was dissolved 18 months after the first audit. Dawn was barred from holding executive roles. The remaining partners scattered, taking whatever they could salvage. But me, I found peace, not in their fall, but in my rise. In knowing I didn't just get fired, I got free. And I used that freedom to build something better, stronger, and cleaner. So if you ever find yourself discarded after giving everything to a system that doesn't care, remember my story. Document everything. Stay quiet when it counts. Strike only when it matters. And never ever let anyone tell you that silence is your only option. Because sometimes the best revenge is surviving, succeeding, and being the story that inspires others to rise.